I am Lorens and this is Doing Jazz. Hello everyone and welcome to Doing Jazz. My name is Lorens and this episode is with bassist Mark Wade. Mark is an accomplished musician whose excellence has garnered recognitions on several jazz publications, including being featured as one of DownBeat Magazine's top 10 bass players. In addition to being a successful performer, Mark is also a well-regarded educator who has taught bass at several colleges and universities in the New York City's tri-state area. Mark currently performs with the Mark Wade Trio, which comprises him on bass, Tim Harrison on piano, and Scott Newman on drums. Their latest album, Moving Day, is a collection of songs that are mostly written by Mark Wade. The compositions of Moving Day have been carefully executed to produce rich trio sounds that beautifully thrive by themselves, yet subtly creating an inviting room for a sideman or even the listener to musically interject. The song playing in the background is titled Wide Open. During my conversation with Mark, you'll hear the songs Another Night in Tunisia, Midnight in the Cathedral, and the title track, Moving Day. Towards the end of the conversation, you'll hear the song In the Fading Ray of Sunlight. After listening to this episode, you can learn more about Mark Wade by going to the website of the show, www.doingjazz.net, and you can listen to more episodes of Doing Jazz by subscribing on iTunes, Spotify, or any of the available podcast vendors. While on iTunes, please rate the show, leave a comment, and share the show with your loved ones. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I present Mark Wade. In your face. Mark Wade, welcome to Doing Jazz.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. As I was telling you earlier, when you told me you wanted to come on the show, I read a little bit about you and I found out that you are actually faculty. You're a faculty member at Lehigh and maybe some other school, I think. You teach bass at a few universities, or a couple.
Right now, the only university is at Lehigh University,
Lehigh,
but
okay.
I have taught at other locations here in New York, other smaller schools.
Oh, okay.
Right now, my only quote-unquote official position is at Lehigh University. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I kind of relate to that because I'm also a college professor. So we have something in common. I'm like, I want to talk to this guy. I want to learn more about what he does. But let's talk about your music first.
Great.
And then we can go back to your classroom gig. So the album is called Moving Day.
Yes.
Yeah. It came out this year, 2018.
Correct. We recorded it back in June of 2017, and we had two releases. The first one was over in Europe towards the end of January, and then just about a week later, it was released then around the world, North America, Japan, etc. So, now it's out everywhere.
When you talk about the releases, are you're with a label, or is this you're releasing it under your own label, your own independent label?
Well, the answer to both questions is actually yes.
Okay.
Yeah, in Europe, the distribution and the release was on a label in Berlin called Edition 46 Records. So they helped really get my music out in the European territories. And then everywhere else, I released it myself under my own label, Mark Wade Music. So that's why we had the two releases. They're two different promotional campaigns. And as someone who self-released my last record entirely with a limited release in Europe on that same label in Berlin. I've kind of learned a little bit more how you do that kind of thing and how it's best to position the record so that the most people hear it.
Wow. I want to learn more about that maybe later on. I might be calling on you.
Sure.
I might be hitting you up and bothering you. Yeah. So it's a trio work. It's a trio project.
Yes.
Who are the other instrumentalists? You play the bass, obviously.
Yes. So I'm the trio on this record, which has been my working trio for the last 4 years, includes Tim Harrison on piano and Scott Newman on the drums. And while I've known them actually for longer than the time we've been together, it's really only in the last 4 years that we've been for almost 5 years now that we've been a group. But it's been great to have a chance to keep the same group together, to have the same personnel, and I think it's something that kind of helps to grow the music and make have it something where you're not always starting from scratch with new musicians, but you start to develop an identity together, and that's been really fun.
I was listening to the music and it sounds so rich, even though it's just a trio, and at the same time you guys play so beautifully that you could also make room for additional instrumentalists or even a vocalist. And I was wondering, how were they just able to stick to a trio, throughout? Did they ever have that urge to call in a sideman, call in a saxophonist or a vocalist?
Well, it's interesting. I picked the piano trio format as a bass player because it gives you a lot more room for expression, and just sonically there's so much more room when you have just piano, bass, and drums and you don't have additional horn players. So the piano trio is always just a format that really attracted me personally, whether it was Bill Evans' piano trios, Keith Jarrett, Chick Corea, just so many, Brad Meldau, a more quote-unquote modern player, more recent maybe than some of the classics, but particularly the Bill Evans trio was something that really had a big impact on me, with Scott LaFaro as the bass player in that group, just how he really changed the way the bass interacted in that setting. And because there was that room, being that I'm the leader of the group, I felt like it gave me a little bit more room than I might have in other groups conventionally to have room to just for expression, to play, to be heard, to solo, and what have you. But certainly, this group has actually performed sometimes with an extra person, with a saxophone player or with a vocalist, and I'd like to do that as well. I think early on here, I've established the trio as an identity. That this location that we kind of exist in musically is an identity that we've formed. But certainly in the future, I would consider bringing in another musician. In fact, I actually have an arrangement written for the group it's a kind of a mashup of two Billy Strayhorn tunes, Take the A Train, which obviously everyone knows, and then his ballad Daydream. And what I did is I stitched together the music material in such a way that it tells a different story. So it's Take the Daydream is what it is. So you were daydreaming on the A Train. But the only way, while we've performed that as an instrumental, where it really makes sense is if it's performed with a vocalist. So I think that in the future there may be a few kind of collaborations like that. It might be interesting to try.
You mentioned some piano trios that inspire you, like the Bill Evans and Chick Corea. Those are pianists.
Yes.
All right. And they're the band leaders. They play the melody. They take the high notes and everybody hears what they're playing. But you're the bassist. So naturally you got to sit back until you solo. So this is something I've always wondered about bass players who are band leaders. How are you able to do that? Does that ever get to your head? Like, do you ever say, okay, I'm always doing the background, I'm always at the background, meanwhile this is my gig?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's something that I really thought about. One of the ways that you because I think you hear bass players as band leaders. There's a danger sometimes that we do end up kind of taking a back seat sometimes, because let's face it, it's the saxophone players that are out there as the soloists all the time, maybe guitar players, even piano players. But to establish yourself as a leader, as a bass player, I think you can go one of two ways. You can go as someone who is doing arranging for a big group, where you're kind of flexing your muscles and your presence more as the composer and the project leader, and less as the star instrumentalist, if you will, in the ensemble. And then you can go the other way, where it can be, the other extreme is to go where it's just all about you as a player and not about anyone else, and so it's very bass heavy. And I tried to thread.
Who does that? Like Marcus Miller does.
Marcus Miller, to a degree. I think he's a great musician, and he has such great projects. And I mean, Marcus, I have tremendous respect for him, and I think he's able to be the virtuoso without it just being about the bass, where it's about the music. He happens to just be a great player. But certainly Marcus is someone who can step out as a soloist or as a bigger identity, and which I love. And so for my project, I kind of wanted to try to thread the needle, where most of the material that we're presenting on the CD is my music. It's stuff I've written as a composer, and it's stuff that I've written more and more now with this piano trio format in mind and these players in mind.
I see.
So while there's that side of it, I also really push myself to be an equal soloist. It's understood and a given that that the piano player in a piano trio setting will be a great soloist. Everyone expects that. And they might expect the drummer to be a really great soloist if he's someone who's very technical or very expressive or very exciting, but not always the bass player. And so, although certainly there are countless examples of guys who play great in that setting, I wanted to try to model myself after one of those that setting. So my concept for this trio was always one where it was a three-way conversation, that there would be room for the piano player to step out and be a soloist, a room for me to step out, room for the drummer to step out, and also to create that lovely dynamic in any really great piano trio, where it isn't just about the individual soloist, but the group identity, the group cohesion, the interplay, giving space, taking space, all that kinds of stuff. So in that sense, the piano trio is a very malleable format, because all three people are, not only do they have the possibility of having room to express themselves, you kind of have the obligation to really stand out as a soloist and as a team player. There's nowhere to hide. And that's really what attracted to me as a musically, just where I was inclined to go, and also as a challenge, to challenge myself as a bass player. Let's face it, we're not usually the first people are looking for the great solo to come from the bass chair, right? Usually we expect it from the saxophone player, we expect it from those other places. So I wanted to really push myself to be an equal soloist and not seen as anything other than to keep the excitement and the ideas of the music going.
Nicely said. I really get it now.
So
you only played acoustic upright bass here?
Well, in this group, yes. As a professional, I also do play electric bass. On certain gigs, but on this record, it's just the acoustic bass.
Okay. I have a few of the songs that I've listened to over and over again, because I either like the arrangement or I just like the song. The way you did Another Night in Tunisia, I really enjoy your arrangement, your alternate take to the song. Do you want to talk about how that arrangement came to be?
Sure. Yeah, that one has proven to be a very popular choice from the CD. It's one I'm very proud of.
Okay.
You know, there are two songs on the album that were not mine, that I did arrangements. One was Another Night in Tunisia, and the other one is an arrangement of Autumn Leaves.
Autumn Leaves, okay.
And in both cases, I purposely tried to pick a song that had been done many, many times before, that had been done to death almost. Like how many versions of Night in Tunisia have been recorded? I mean, so many. It's a great song, you know, for good reason. It's a wonderful tune, but it's been done quite a bit. And I wanted to kind of, again, challenge myself to pick something that would be instantly recognizable, but to try to make that sound like it belonged in a set of my own original music. And hence all the alterations and the changes to it. I think that's a real challenge, to present old material in a new way, particularly in this day and age with so many great jazz artists who have done so many great recordings. So the idea behind that one, the arranging conceit, if you will, is the odd meter changes. It's all the changes in meter and some of the reharmonization that takes place. Just trying to take some of those original ideas and develop it in my own voice, in some small way, you know, to create. It's not a new piece of music, of course, but maybe a way of hearing that song that people hadn't thought of or heard before.
Nice. There's this one, I can't remember the name. Midnight in the Cathedral.
Yes, that's
something
it.
Okay.
That's it. Yeah.
It's very free.
Yes.
And it's freeing. Yeah. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that is the one. There's actually a few songs on the album that have moments of freedom, of literally where there is no time, where we're really opening up the structure of the music, where we can have a lot of possibilities. Midnight in the Cathedral is definitely the one that has the most of that. It really has the most freedom. The beginning and the ending sections of the tune are completely unmetered. There's no beat. So while we have a chord structure to play on, when things happen and how they happen is really pretty loose. And that's been one of the great joys with this particular ensemble, as we get more comfortable with one another, to be able to kind of explore these ideas and push our boundaries a little bit. The middle section of that tune then goes back to a metered section for the bass solo as a contrast to that. But that exploring a group improvisation where there is no time, it's something that I really enjoy doing. It's something I think the group does well. It's something I want to continue to do. That concept, while explored by many other people, for me personally, was really inspired by a lot of the music of a piano player who I studied with when I was in college by the name of Frank Kimbrough. Frank is currently the piano player for the Maria Schneider Jazz Orchestra multi-Grammy winning ensemble. But in his own right as a leader, he's recorded, over a dozen albums, I'm sure, at this point. And he likes to explore a lot of those concepts of where it's out of time, maybe sort of, but not really, this kind of interesting concept of playing and expressing time with the group. Not coincidentally, he also, often plays as a piano trio. So another trio format, that it's some of what he did, I think, kind of helped me to get to a place like Midnight in the Cathedral and a few other things that we do.
I really enjoyed listening to that one. Yeah. And then the title track, Moving Day, it's another one I like. I like the piano riff, the repetitive nature of the piano riff, and then how the whole rhythm kind of emulated that in a vibrant way. Still, it wasn't boring at all, and it wasn't haunting. It was just, I just like it. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That is, that track, that title track, definitely a challenge always to take as a composer. I think it's a challenge, and yet can be very rewarding when you take a small motif like that, a small musical idea, and try to then, from that small idea, grow the rest of the composition, to have everything come out from that. And if you do it well, I think it has a strong impact. The danger is if you don't do it well, it can be a little boring, or it can get a little stale if there's too much repetition, if there isn't enough contrast. So that's always something that you grapple with as a composer, at least for me. That kind of motivic writing is something that always has kind of been very interesting to me. It's always kind of struck a chord, whether it's in jazz music or classical music, or when I was studying composition in school. Those things I know always stuck with me, so it's probably not a mistake that I tend to gravitate towards that kind of writing at times myself. But keeping it fresh and exciting, like you say, keeping it something where it doesn't it doesn't become too repetitive is that delicate balance that you're always trying to go for.
Yeah, nice. You are listening to Doing Jazz with Lorens Chuno. The guest on this episode is bassist Mark Wade. Let's go back to the very beginning. Where are you from?
All right, I am from many places. I moved. Well, it's not a coincidence that the title of the second CD is Moving.
Okay, I was gonna ask that too.
Because I've moved about 14 or 15 times
in
the course of my life.
Wow.
So a lot of the moving I did when I was very young. I was born outside Detroit.
Okay.
And moved around the upper Midwest to a number of places just due to my family's job. We moved around a bit. So I lived in South Bend, Indiana twice.
Okay.
Lived in southern Tennessee, outside Cleveland, Ohio. Started out in Michigan, then moved to New Jersey.
Okay.
And by then, I think I was probably about 7 or 8.
When you moved to New Jersey?
When I moved to New Jersey.
So you explored the Midwest and then I was like, okay,
we saw it all. Yeah, we saw it all. My family, my parents are originally from Wisconsin, so I think we started out in that area. But then moved to New Jersey, moved a few times there, and then came to New York to go to college.
Okay.
I went to NYU.
Yeah.
That's where I studied music, and then here in New York,
for
moved
bass.
quite a few. Yeah, for bass, for bass. I studied with Mike Richmond in the jazz program there at NYU. He's someone I'm still in touch with, and is still very much an inspiration to me today for a number of reasons. But once I was in New York, I moved around quite a bit, like a lot of musicians, especially when you get started.
Yeah.
You can be a bit itinerant.
Exactly.
There can be a lot of moving around.
Looking for cheap rent.
Yeah. Just the act of trying to stay here and keep it going.
Yeah.
It means sometimes you move around a lot.
You start with a couch.
Yeah.
Couch, and then you get your own little room.
I had many of those.
Among 7 people living in a 3-bedroom apartment.
Yeah, the music life isn't as glamorous as some people might think it is.
In New York, at least, it's not.
No.
But it gets better. It
does.
Yeah. When did you move to New York?
So I came here in 1993.
Okay. Yeah.
That's when I started school. So I've been here a long time now. It's always funny to look back and do the math and realize just how much time has gone by.
Yeah, time flies by. Yeah. Especially when you're working really hard on something you like, something that's your passion.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Yeah. I want to ask you a few questions about being a musician in New York. It is tough, very tough. No matter how huge you've become, it's tough,
Yes.
One of the tough areas is getting gigs. How do you do that? How do you navigate that world of getting booked to play your music?
It is. Look, it's definitely a challenge. I mean, as a bass player, one of the blessings is that you can work as a sideman maybe easier than certain other instruments, but it's still very much a challenge. For me, how I've always done it has always been a mix of music. I mentioned that I do play electric bass. I actually started on electric bass. Okay. And because of having the background there, it does mean it gives you some flexibility in the kind of gigs you can do. So while I play jazz gigs, I also play classical gigs. I studied classically and we'll play some classical gigs and also some more commercial type gigs on electric bass. So it's been always a mix of that kind of work that has been how I've been able to cobble together a living and keep moving forward in a career in music in New York. There's opportunity here for sure, but there's also a lot of competition.
Yeah.
So it means that if you're going to
and
do
there are a lot of good people.
Oh, there's so many. So you have to be that much better, than them. If you want to think of it, you have to be just as good, if not better. So the good part of New York is if you take a positive view of that, is that it's always pushing you to be better. It never lets you rest on your laurels. You can never relax. You have to always pick up the instrument and go back to work and practice.
Yeah.
And that is something that has really pushed me to be a much better musician, something I really appreciate. But of course, it is competitive, and that constant grind is something that not everybody's cut out for, I think. And it's not for everyone. On top of just the challenges of living here day to day, like we were talking about, having to move around a lot, especially in the beginning, getting started, there's a certain amount of challenges. So it takes a certain kind of person, a certain kind of personality, I should say, where that's right for you. And if it's not right for you, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It's just, there's just a certain a set of challenges that come with it that that isn't really for everyone.
Yeah, definitely it's not. It's a very, like you were saying, you come here and then you realize everybody is really good. You realize you got to work hard. I have my own stories. As I was telling you, I didn't go to school for music, so I'm always learning, and the learning curve is kind of steep for me. I'm a vocalist and I play the piano a little bit. I moved after school, after I finished my grad school. I moved to New York in 2014 from Pittsburgh. When I was in Pittsburgh, I did well. I had a following. I didn't have any problem getting gigs. I was making some money from my music, even though I didn't depend on it for a living. But I moved here. I saw how good everybody is. The first year, I decided to work on an album, and I worked on the album. I released it in 2016. But between the release and late 2017, I experienced so much growth as a musician. I worked on myself, worked on my art a whole lot, like exponentially better. I got exponentially better. And I listened to the album and I said to myself, I am the weakest link in that album. All the musicians I played with are good. They brought something, and I don't think I brought enough. I pulled the album. And I'm reworking it now. I'm redoing the vocals. I'm remixing it. I'm remastering it. So I'm just following up what you're saying. That's my experience, and mine is a little bit to the extreme. That just to follow up, just to concur with you when it comes to being able to appreciate how everybody is. How good everybody is in New York, every musician, not all of them, but majority.
So many.
And how much competitive it is. Yeah. I have a few questions about performance. All right. Especially when it comes to performing as an instrumentalist. Vocalists sing, and people gravitate to voice than anything. Maybe next, the saxophone is a sexy instrument.
Yeah.
But when you're just a trio and you're performing, you're working hard on the music, you're putting in everything you could, and you're pouring in everything into the music. How do you keep it interesting for the audience?
Good question. There's, besides the general comment I think anyone makes, is that, well, you try to make the music as good as possible and hope they like it. I think specifically keeping an audience interested in what you're doing, whether it's over the course of a career or over a period of time, or just over the course of a concert, a set of music. It's something that sometimes I think, particularly jazz musicians, it's not a question we always ask, because there's a school of thought, a way of approaching this is that you say, well, this is what I do, and you either like it or you don't. I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah.
Which is, it's okay. I mean, you want to, I think it's important for all musicians to do what they feel is their music, to make it a genuine personal musical statement, and that's important. But I don't think it necessarily has to be hearsay to consider how the audience is going to react or respond, or how you can best reach the audience with what you're trying to say. So whether that's, considering what you program in the course of a set, I know as someone who's also writing the music, not just performing the music, that is a real consideration I have, that it's not as if I'm trying to write what I think people will like. But I think that there's nothing, because that doesn't serve anyone. You're not going to make your best music if you're trying to write what other people, what you think other people will like. That being said, I don't think that there's anything wrong with approaching it with the idea of how can I best communicate what I'm trying to do to them. And I think that some musicians will do themselves a disservice when they don't ever consider that other side of the process of not just playing, but how that music is received. So I think that's something that one can consider in their presentation, whether it's your writing, where you have some control over that, or how you program music, or just your concept behind the group. There'll be some musicians who, particularly some jazz musicians, who would hear that and consider it blasphemy, perhaps. But I think that, again, that not that you're chasing the audience, but that you at least consider them, their point of view. I think that there's really nothing wrong with that.
Because I've been thinking about it. I've been to a few concerts, jazz shows in my life, and I enjoy it because I love the music. But as a performer, I think to myself, how are the other parts of the audience, how are they responding to this? How are these people, are they all jazz lovers? Is that why they're here? Is there anything else these performers can do to get somebody else, to convert somebody, who might not necessarily be into this genre of music? I always think about that, and I wonder how other musicians feel about it.
I think that I don't even say there's a divide. I would say that especially in jazz, there is an idea of here's what we do, like it or not. And I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to, at least, like I said, consider the other side and think about how to build your audience, which is tough. It's tough to do for anyone. And as you said, like even people who are at the absolute top of their game who live in New York City, have to work hard to get people out. There's very few people who can roll out of bed, advertise a concert, and get a full house every time. Obviously, the most famous people in the world can do that, but even people who are a tier down from that can surprisingly struggle with audiences in a town where on any given night you can open up the jazz listings of a paper and it'll list 40 concerts, and that's not all of them. And you could go see any one of these, and there's any number of those people are actually famous or internationally famous people. True. So the question is, how do you get them to come see you?
True. Yeah. I have a few questions about learning jazz. You will be the right person to ask because you're a teacher and you teach in colleges, so you can even you're the right person. How do you practice?
Well, that's a good question.
You can restrict it to bass, but you can also some things that are general to.
I think in general, because practicing, look, that's such an important thing. People always know, well, you have to practice, right? And they say, well, I probably have to practice a lot to get better. And that's true, but it's not the whole story. It's how you practice and what you practice is so important. Part of being practicing effectively for something like jazz or classical music or anything where the requirements are so high on the players just to be able to sort of do it, just to sort of participate. It's so high. I think one of the most important things is just having a consistent practice routine. Okay. Practicing 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week, is much more effective than practicing once a week for an hour. Even if it equals the same amount of time, it's the idea that you're doing it every day.
Okay.
It's good for a couple of reasons. One, your brain is always then kind of connecting with whatever it is you're trying to practice, whether it's something technical like learning a scale or playing a chord or singing a pattern or whatever that happens to be. The process of doing that every single day, I think, has a much greater impact than to do all of that on one day for a longer period of time and then not really revisit it for another week. Also, that sets up a good habit, getting into good practice habits where you are consistently picking up the instrument or the voice or whatever it is that you do and doing it on a regular basis. It becomes a habit, and that's a good habit. You're forming good habits. But then it's working with a teacher, especially initially, but in general, identifying what it is you need to do to get better. Always being curious to know what you don't know, to figure out what you don't know. A good teacher will tell you that, but then at a certain point when you're on your own, to keep that attitude of trying to have an open mind, consider new concepts. But for yourself to be disciplined enough to not just start practicing stuff that you do well, but you want to practice things you don't do well. That's the whole reason of practice time. If you're going to improve, means that you can't just do things that are comfortable. You have to push yourself. And again, I think that takes a certain amount of discipline. It's a certain amount of discipline that happens on your own, in a room by yourself. There's no people helping you. There's no one there to spur you on in the moment. So there's always, with any successful musician, I think you find someone who has, on some level, a great deal of personal discipline and desire. I mean, you have to have the desire, the want to. You have to be inspired to practice. But inspiration isn't enough. You have to be disciplined to know that, hey, even if I don't feel like it, I need to take the instrument out of the case and do this anyways. And that's the less glamorous side of the music business. That's the less glamorous side of making music. But it is 90% of what actually constitutes a career in music. I think is having that commitment, that regular commitment to try to improve yourself a little bit each and every time.
Nice. Now, whenever I write, I start with the bass line. The first thing I come up with is the bass line. I might not be able to transcribe it and write the notes, but I memorize it or I sing it, So that's kind of natural to me. And I also feel like it might be the same way for a few people, As a composer and a bassist, do you think every musician should try to learn a little bit about the bass, about playing the bass?
I actually think it's really helpful. In fact, I was very fortunate to write a masterclass article for DownBeat Magazine along those lines. It was actually an article about how to write for the double bass if you're not already a double bass player, because it's really an instrument that comes with great mystery for a lot of people, because I think, they don't really understand the instrument sometimes. They're not always sure if what they're asking is too much to ask of the bass player or if it's not enough. So you see some people write some exceedingly complicated, difficult lines that are not even particularly playable or sit very well on the instrument. And then you'll see other people where they want to write something for the bass, but they're afraid of oh, well, can they do this or can they do that? Or should I just leave it up to you? And it takes a long time, if you're not a bass player, to know how all of that works. And, my advice is always sit down with a bass player. If you're like, could you do this? See how their instrument physically is set up, see what they have to do. And they can show you, here's why this is hard. Here's why this thing would be easy or et cetera. So you get a little better sense of how it works. But I mean, of course, it's beneficial to know every instrument that you're writing for, to know something about it. But it's not an exaggeration, I think, to say that the bass is usually the one that is the least understood because of, look, there are certain technical limitations that the bass has that other instruments don't have. It is, physically, especially the double bass, is physically a large instrument to play. The strings are thick. They don't move as fast as if you're a violinist or a guitarist. So there are certain considerations, and yet there's a lot of great things the bass can do. And the more you know about the instrument, myself included, I think the better you write for it.
Yeah, nice. Who are the bass players you listened to? Like, let's start with people from back in the day.
When it comes to jazz, because playing different kinds of music, gosh, you could list so many players. But when it comes to jazz, and particularly acoustic bass players, if you're gonna be learning how to play jazz, I had teachers from the school of thought that you have to learn how to play inside before you learn how to play outside.
You mean inside the house?
Yeah, or more like inside the changes, like more straight ahead.
Okay,
If we're looking back at from Charlie Parker onward, more straight ahead bebop kind of playing all the way ahead to the modern day. Some guys want to skip ahead to like whatever the latest modern thing is. And I was glad that my teachers had that attitude, and I did too. You want to learn the basics with anything. And for me, that means going back to learning how to play straight ahead swinging jazz. And the two bass players that always exemplify that the most, that everyone knows, of course, is Ray Brown with Oscar Peterson's trio and Paul Chambers with Miles Davis's group in the 50s. Both of those guys were huge inspirations for me as a bass player getting started. I played along with those records all the time. I mean, just their sense of time and how they swung the band is really the Bible for all jazz bass players when you're getting started. If you have any interest in playing anything that is remotely considered traditional jazz, inside swinging bebop jazz, those are the two guys I always think you have to listen to and reckon with. And as you move forward in the timeline of players, Ron Carter was a big inspiration. I love the Miles Davis groups from the 60s. Those are big records for me. Gary Peacock with Keith Jarrett's trio. Michael Moore, that's a little more modern. Red Mitchell, certainly. Scott LaFaro, who I mentioned before, certainly with Bill Evans' trio. My own teacher, Mike Richmond, also, a wonderful bass player, virtuosic, can do so much, and someone like Christian McBride, who's in modern days kind of has the mantle of the acoustic bass player who can do it all, and he's a tremendous musician. He deserves all the accolades he gets. So it's a long list of names, and each different players you take different things from. I don't sound like Ron Carter. I don't pattern myself after Ron Carter. Hopefully I don't pattern myself after any one of those names I listed, but I have tremendous respect for all of them, and you find things from each person's playing that you want to try to take for yourself and incorporate into your own identity as a bass player.
Yeah. Nice. Do you still go to the Midwest? Do you still travel there?
I do. I still have some family out there. I'm not out there all that much. Right now, my family. I do still have some family in Wisconsin.
Okay.
But that's really the extent of where anybody is at in the Midwest these days.
How about? Do you ever go back to Detroit?
No. It's a funny thing. I was born in Livonia, Michigan, just a suburb of Detroit. And I moved away when I was about a year and a half old. I don't really remember it very well. And I've never been back. And I've always thought it would be kind of interesting to go back and just to see it, just the place I was born. Having lived so many different places and so many different houses and so many different, all these different situations.
Why were your parents traveling that much?
My father had a job where if the company, it was a he had a business. He worked for various businesses where if the business got bought or sold, or he had a chance to take a promotion, we would move. A lot of people always assume that my family was in the Army, because a lot of times if people in the Army, then they move around a lot as well. But so it just kind of worked out that way, that every year or two we moved, in the early part of my life. So, but I'm not back in the Midwest as much. It's always nice to go back. It's such a different perspective than you have living in New York City. Different pace of life, different quality of life. But like anything else, every place has its pluses and minuses. So you can find good things there, but you can find good things here too.
Yeah, good. We're going to conclude with a very silly game. Silly, but very difficult. I consider it difficult. Okay. You tell me. It's called Turn Up, Mute. I'll give you two options.
Okay.
You turn one up and you mute the other.
Okay.
You know, and the caveat is that the stuff, the option you're turning up doesn't mean that you hate the other one. It just means for now, this is how you feel. All right.
Okay.
So, arranging and teaching. Which one do you turn up?
Oof. Boy, that is a hard question because I really love doing both right now.
Okay.
If I had to pick one, though, I would turn up arranging.
Okay. Good. All right. Is there anything about arranging anything that stands out about arranging?
It's just, if you're arranging your own music, like say you come up with an idea and you arrange it, you have this great freedom to come up with something. But then you have, with all freedom comes a responsibility of then using that wisely, doing something good with that, not just not being self-indulgent, not running through it, worrying about what someone may think or not think, but it gives you a lot of freedom. If you're arranging someone else's music, it's a completely different challenge, but equally exciting. Yeah. Here now, you've been put in a box. You've got a starting place. You've got, as we were talking before about Another Night in Tunisia or Autumn Leaves, where so many people have done it before. Now you have to try to get out of that box. You have to try to come up with something of your own. So there are two very different ways of looking at arranging, both that are very rewarding. I love my arrangements of other people's music just as much as the ones I've done of my own, but for different reasons. Because they in some ways they come from two different places.
Is there anything frustrating about teaching? I mean, it's kind of obvious, but or let me ask. Sure. This is a different question, but it's kind of related. Sorry.
Sure.
Is there something that you can tell? If there's one piece of advice you can give to up and coming teachers, because a lot of musicians and the ones who listen to this show, they teach also. And you're kind of, I don't want to say a veteran to age you, but you've done it for close to 20 years.
No, I would say this, I heard this comment actually from a friend of mine who had studied with, actually, I heard this from someone I had studied with, a really fine double bass player by the name of Joe Bongiorno, who was the associate principal for the New York City Opera when that was in existence. And Joe studied with Homer Mensch, who was considered the double bass pedagogue in classical music in New York City. He taught everybody. He was the principal of the New York Phil, but all these wonderful bass players who went on to win big jobs in other places, he taught them. He was considered not just a great player, but a great teacher. And he often said that when he gives lessons to people, he doesn't give lessons. He writes prescriptions for his students. So in other words, just like a doctor diagnoses each patient that comes to them and gives them what that particular person needs. So a good teacher does not come in with a lesson plan and say, here's what I teach. You either get it or you don't. A good teacher is able to look at each individual student and understand what motivates that student, what doesn't motivate that student, what that student needs to hear, maybe what that student needs to hear right now. And I think that is much harder than just having your curriculum that you say you either get this or you don't. So why teaching is rewarding is for that very reason. Why teaching is frustrating is that same reason, because it really forces you as a teacher to not be lazy and to really try to figure out how you can reach each individual student and make them better at what they're there to do. So when they walk out of that door, they're a better bass player than when they walk in it.
Nicely said. Thank you about that. Thank you. Another two options: turn up, mute. Charles Mingus, Ray Brown.
Oh, these are hard.
You have to choose one.
Here I just talked about Ray Brown, how he's, the Bible of everything, but I'm going to turn up.
You never mentioned Charles Mingus. I didn't mention. That was why I deliberately said, okay.
I was a great oversight on my own. I'm going to turn up Charlie Mingus on this for sure.
Okay.
Because look, Ray Brown is the Bible of playing the double bass and playing straight ahead time. Nobody does it better. But I'm turning up Charles because his music, his band. There are two records of his, Mingus and Mingus Dynasty, two very important records for me personally. Just the writing and the creativity, it still sounds so modern and so shocking and so exciting and so new. Even today, I was just listening to those records recently, and I was just thinking, man, there are just so many great ideas here I could mine for myself, for my own music. Things I hear things there that remind me of, oh, I should be thinking about this, or oh, I should be thinking about that. I don't pattern myself. Mingus as a bass player, who I still have tremendous respect for, was not someone who I personally gravitated towards as far as copying or emulating just as a bass player. But as a musician, I can't think of anybody better.
Nice. Interesting. You had a list of people, and now,
and I'm sure I left another 20 names off that list. There's just so many guys.
Nice. Now, you ready for this too? Okay, these are your two of your children. So be careful. Wide Open, In the Fading Ray of Sunlight.
Oh, that's easy, actually.
Oh, okay.
That's easy. I turn up In the Fading Rays of Sunlight.
Oh, I like that one too.
That song has a certain personal connection for me that I really, really love. That was first of all, it was the first song that I wrote for this record.
Oh, nice.
So it's one that I've had the longest, but that was the first time, really, I had tried writing to a certain specific image or picture idea. Wide Open is the only thing on that record of mine, of my original composition, that is music written in the abstract. I didn't write it around a certain idea or person or place or experience. All the other original material on the record is written with something in mind, whether it's a concept, an idea, a picture, an event in my life. Moving Day, the title track, is all about that experience of moving. And In the Fading Rays of Sunlight was the first time I had ever really considered, as a composer, trying to capture a certain picture or a moment or image. Nice. In that case, I was trying to capture the setting sun on a summer's day. I was somewheres out. I was actually in the process of mixing my first record, Event Horizon. I hadn't even finished that record when I had gotten the idea for this song, and I had come out of the studio, the mixing studio, and I was out somewheres in New Jersey where it was very green and pretty, and it was a beautiful summer's day, and the sun was setting, and there was something about that picture that just struck me, how pretty it was, how moving that was, and it was what inspired that song. So, and it was the first time that had really happened for me. So it's a song that I always have a certain special connection to. And it's why not that I don't like Wide Open, and I'm very proud of that track. It's one that has, certainly gotten people's attention. But for me, that one track, In the Fading Rays, is definitely one I have a real connection to.
Nice. Who are the other two members of your trio again?
Scott Newman on drums and Tim Harrison on piano. And incidentally, they also both teach at Lehigh University with me. That's part of the connection we have, is that we're all on the faculty there.
Hi, Scott. Hi, Tim. You guys did a very good job.
Yes, they did.
Mark Wade, thank you for coming on.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Later.